Good morning, gentlemen. It's a wonderful time. I'm going to talk to you about a very interesting topic. I'm going to focus on Russia. Russia, as you know, is headed by Vladimir Putin at the moment, and we have to wait and see what he's going to do for Russia. Well, the first thing I'll tell you is that Russia is now in a downslide, and this downslide really commenced after 1905. Earlier, for almost 400 years, Russia was ruled by the Tsars, and there was very great Russians who were sitting at the throne. And Moscow, we got the names of Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Catherine the Great, so many of them. And things were going fine till 1905. That is the time when Tsar Nicholas II was in power in Russia. But I thought he should have been more circumspect, more, astute to see the dangers around him. That was the time the Communist Party in Russia suddenly reared its head. And as you're aware, this theory of communism promoted by Karl Marx. And Marx wrote his theory not for Russia, he wrote it for the Western democracies, that is Germany and England, France. That is the age of industrialization, and his appeal was to the workers. But Lenin was the place who studied this man, Karl Marx, and applied his theory to Russia. Earlier to that, I can tell you that the Russian empire under the Tsars had expanded, and Russia was a global power, so much so that in the 19th century, what is known as the Great Game, the British were mighty scared of the Russians coming into India also, and they're making plans to somehow control Russia and beat Russia at their own game. But then, as I told you, in 1905, they started off the downslide. There was the Russo-Japanese War, and for the first time an Asian power defeated the Western power. The Russians were defeated, and of course, Tsar Nicholas II had a sorry face. And then came the First World War, and the Tsar, as usual, sided with the British and the French. But the net result was a disaster. The Russian army is not up to the task. They were defeated badly, and ultimately the situation became so bad in Russia. There was rioting all around, no food available. The Russian army fully equipped, and there's nothing what to do but to face the revolution. And that is the crucial point to note. The Tsars, if they had played their cards properly, they would be ruling even now. But they played their cards so badly, particularly Tsar Nicholas II, that they allowed the communists to seize power. Now, what is communism? I think it's a utopia. It's just no sense, actually. But a utopia is what people are looking forward to. Well, you're looking for a utopia, the impossible. You're looking for prosperity, a ruling of the working class, and all that BS. And Marx, I think, is one of the greatest philosophers, but that's a philosophy only and not the practical aspect. Marx wrote his philosophy and went away to sleep. But the practical aspects were ignored by him. He didn't know how to go to enforce the so-called class society he was propagating. Well, what happened in 1917 then? There were two revolutions in Russia. One was led by Kerensky, and these people called the Mensheviks. Now they wanted the Russian state to change, but they were willing to have the Tsar as the head of the state, and they wanted to have a constitutional government headed by the Tsar, and then going for a socialist society. But Kerensky didn't have the hold, because the situation in Russia was so bad at that time that there's nothing anyone could have stopped it. And despite having the biggest empire in the world, having taken over almost the entire Siberia, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, Southeast Russia, there was nothing the Tsar could do at that critical moment when the communists were in force. There was a revolution, what's called the famous October Revolution. As I told you, a lot of BS. It was a lot of euphoria, nothing else, a lot of gas balloons. But the net result is they cooked the goose of the Soviet Union, which came into being. The Soviet Union was the successor to the Russian state, or rather the Tsarist state, and the sad part is that communism was a stepping stone to the destruction of one of the biggest empires in world history, which had lasted for more than 400 years. Now, in hindsight, we can see that the creation of the USSR was an anomaly, something which should have been avoided. And I thought that the Mensheviks, that is, Kerensky was the better bet. If the Tsar had continued, there would have been continuity, and the Russian Empire would have been intact. But the men who came, Lenin and then Stalin, I think they were just bloodthirsty individuals, and they had no horizon to look something beyond 100 years. You know how Hitler thought was talking of a 1,000-year regime, and the damn thing collapsed just in 12 years. The 1,000-year regime just didn't exist. And similarly, the communists were talking of perpetuity of the regime. They're talking of the USSR as a global power, as a counterpart to the American imperialism, but actually it all came to zero. Because the inherent nature of communism is destructive. It heralds destruction. It's a nihilistic doctrine, that is, you want to replace an educated and affluent class with another class with all the ills that go with it. Net result was that they wiped out one elite class but created another elite, a technocrat elite, a senseless elite, an elite without emotion, and that was what communism really was about. You know, there was a time when I was in college, we always looked up to the USSR as one of the greats of world history and as a counterpart to the Americans, but that was all. Inside, it was being moth-eaten because Marx had just laid the theory. He didn't know how he was going to fill in the meat in the flesh and bone skeleton which he had created. The net result of all this was that the USSR began to falter. The economy collapsed, and the various races in the USSR raised their heads, which had been conquered by the Tsar. And finally, history finds a man, they say, who would break up the Soviet Union, and there was a man called Mikhail Gorbachev. He got elected as the president of the USSR, but I think he was an extremely inept man, and probably, as he says, it was an act of providence that Mikhail Gorbachev became the president of the USA, and the result of all this was that he heralded the doom of the USSR. I cannot even imagine that in 1992, within a space of 6 months, the entire USSR collapsed like a pack of cards into 18 small countries. And the Russians at that time, with their wits' end, they had the tremendous nuclear power, of course, nuclear submarines, nuclear bombs, ICBMs, whatnot. But economically, they didn't know from where they're going to get the bread, how they're going to keep the people fed, and how they're going to match up to America, which had a phenomenal increase in the per capita and GDP income. Russia was not even a match to it, as the USSR. And the truncated Russia was even worse off. Well, things did improve a little when Vladimir Putin came in. I thought he was a man cast in the mold of Joseph Stalin. But cast in the mold of Joseph Stalin is easy to talk, but put into practice, you can't do it. It's not that's a simple thing. And this is precisely what happened, because Putin had the right idea, but he didn't have the meat, the muscle, the economic might to take up the challenge of the Western world. And he burnt himself very badly in Ukraine, a battle which had gone on to almost over 2.5 years, and the net result appears to be a big zero as far as the USSR is concerned. That is the earlier USSR and now the success of the Russian state. Russia, as you must realize, is a truncated state, its population reduced by 50% of what was earlier, and population is inversely proportional to the manpower you supply and the military might, and the Russian military might correspondingly got down. They didn't have the manpower, and this is becoming more and more apparent in the battle in Ukraine. You may have the weapons, but you need the men to use them, fire them, and that's what the Russians are not having. And now there are men in Russia who don't want to fight. They don't want to feel they waste their time fighting some war in Ukraine, throwing some bombs here and there. They like to have a good time. Maybe go to the club with their dates, the nightclub, enjoy yourself, have a drink. That's not coming. And you add up all these things, the Russian state doesn't have the morale to give battle to the Americans. That is what has happened now. You know what's happened? Russia is floundering. Now, what's going to be in the future? Many people ask me, Captain, what do you think is going to happen in the future? Do you think Russia is going to become a great power like it was in the days of the USSR and the Tsar? I'm afraid I've got a big answer to that, and that is no. I don't think Russia is ever going to achieve those heights. First of all, as I told you, communism is a destructive philosophy, and it's a good thing it didn't take root in India, and it helped in one thing, and that it destroyed the Tsarist empire. And then it went and destroyed the Soviet empire, the USSR. Because communism was a godless philosophy, and I don't know how really Marx thought about it, because I've studied communism in detail. I read Karl Marx's treatise, The Das Kapital, but there's nothing to show that it's something great. He's talking of economic theory, all right. He's talking of the bourgeois, the middle class mentality, and he's mounting cliches like opium is the religion of the people, and all that, what I call is BS. He's talking of dictatorship of the proletariat, but he can't tell us how he's going to enforce the proletariat dictatorship in the world. Well, it was on the cards that communism would collapse, and I think if I remember correctly, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, during whose time the USSR really sank like a stone, were convinced that communism is finished in Russia. And thanks to the finishing of communism, the end of the Soviet state were dismembered, and first of all, 18 independent states were created, and Russia finished with its global power forever. I don't think whatever happened, that Russia is ever going to achieve that height now. The Russians, as you have seen, have been fighting for 2.5 years. They haven't been able to win the war in Ukraine. What the hell is going on, man? You can't fight a bloody war and you can't win it in Ukraine in an army which is 1/3 your size. And the factor is the Americans. The Americans gone to Ukraine in a big way, and as Joe Biden said, will support Ukraine out as long as it gets, and he's been doing it. And if the only saving grace for Russia could be if Donald Trump wins. He's a man who doesn't want a war, and he said he would stop the Ukraine war. Let's wait and see what happens. But as it stands now, whether Donald Trump comes back or no, Russia can never achieve the global position it had occupied earlier. That's the precise thing that's happened earlier. Russia is not going to be anywhere. And it's a sad story. Russia clutching at straws now, trying to keep India in their orbit. And India has got to think twice, because the Russians have bungled up so badly. India can't bank on the Russians at all for anything. Even the S-400 missile system, which is India's bought, has been delayed by over a year. The Russians don't have the wherewithal to give it to you. Russian weapons export has come to zero. The foreign exchange has come to zero. Though the economy has become a war economy and has thrived, but that's got no meaning really. The fact remains that Russia is a global power, finished and dependent on China now. And I'm afraid China is not going to do much either, but that be a separate video. In this video, I'll only say this much, that Russia has thrown in the towel. There's nothing they can do. They have a nuclear power, right. But I don't think they're going to use it. They'll never use it, because that would well be the destruction of the Russian state. Well, gentlemen, I hope you like this video. So whether Vladimir Putin comes or Putin's daddy comes or someone comes, I don't think Russia is going to reach the heights of the Tsars or the height of the USSR when Nikita Khrushchev was heading the Soviet Union. It's a sad story, but they're always sad stories. And let's see if there's going to be a silver lining to this one. I don't think so. We'll have to wait and see what happens. I close now, gentlemen. I hope you like this video of mine. Share it with your friends and come back for more. In the meanwhile, I'll say goodbye. God bless. Take care. Jai Hind.